Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Arabiya English. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's programme, with President Trump's peace plan for Ukraine appearing to make headway, we ask how close could the warring parties be to signing an agreement? And how much has the plan been modified during the course of the last few days? Plus, we'll be examining President Trump's executive order, which designates some branches of the Muslim Brotherhood as foreign terrorist organisations. Hello and welcome to the programme. We begin with the latest on Ukraine. Could we finally be approaching an end to the war? Well, after nearly 4 years of fighting, President Donald Trump's administration has unveiled a 28-point peace plan, though several sticking points remain. Well, one major concern raised by Ukraine was that the proposal favoured Russia and that it would require Kyiv to give up territory. However, following intense negotiations, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has agreed to the US brokered framework. Well, President Trump's overseas envoy, Steve Witkoff, will now hold talks at the Kremlin next week as the US continues to push for a deal. Well, let's get more now. We can speak to Yuriy Sak, who is a former advisor to the Ukrainian Defence Ministry. He joins us now from Kyiv. Yuriy, let's just start before we discuss the original and updated 28-point plan. What is the latest in Kyiv today? What's been the situation on the battleground as well?
Good afternoon, Tom. In Kyiv, the situation is very difficult, I should say, because during the past months, Ukraine overall and Kyiv in particular have been the target of massive combined missile and drone attacks. And as a result, a lot of our energy infrastructure has been damaged badly. This means that the inhabitants of Kyiv are regularly experiencing power cuts, which of course makes it very difficult for people, especially families with children and elderly. And of course, every time such an attack happens, just like the 2 nights before, Russian drones and missiles hit residential areas, killing civilians. In the latest attack, 7 people in Kyiv were killed. Oftentimes they are covered in the rubble, and it takes hours and hours for emergency services to actually dig out the bodies of these people. So it's pretty bad, but we're still standing, we're still resilient. And if you ask anyone in the streets of Kyiv whether people are prepared to give up and capitulate, the answer will be a resounding no.
Thanks for bringing us the latest there, Yuriy. And of course, Ukraine and its people have endured 3 years and 9 months of this kind of violence. Let's talk about efforts to bring about an end to the violence. There is, of course, this 28-point plan, which has now, we understand, been revised to some extent. President Trump said yesterday it was having some fine-tuning. What's your understanding of how the plan has changed?
I think we need to understand that what was presented to the world a few days ago as a 28-point plan was just a draft. It was a framework that was the baseline from which the parties have started negotiations, or rather restarted the negotiation process. And on Sunday, Ukrainian side has met with the US counterparties in Geneva, and they have worked point by point on all of these proposed clauses of the prospective peace plan. And of course, they have identified successfully the most contentious issues. And we have seen that both parties have emerged from those negotiations very optimistic. And we have heard Marco Rubio saying that it's been the most constructive meeting since the negotiating process began. Good signs of optimism from President Donald Trump, as well as from President Zelenskyy, who has said again that Ukraine will never be an obstacle to peace, and our Ukrainian team is working 24/7 to ensure that what we have as a result of these talks is a doable, efficient, and just document that will result in a lasting peace. Lasting in a sense that we must not allow Russia to reinvade Ukraine sometimes down the line.
And does it feel to some people in Ukraine like the country is being forced into a deal that perhaps isn't the best deal that could be achieved?
The mood of the Ukrainian people, of course, is different, and you can come across different evaluations of what is happening. Some people feel even betrayed, but some people feel optimistic. The general stance of our government and our president is that we continue to work with the American side. We count on their support. We see that they understand that there are red lines that should not be crossed. And this concerns, of course, issues such as the territorial concessions to which Ukraine can never agree. These concerns issues such as the size of the Ukrainian military, which again is something, it is our sovereign right. And, you know, any other nation in the world has the sovereign right to self-defense. So having an army of the size that we require facing the threat that we face is an understandable red line. And there are other issues like, for example, the war crimes that have been committed, you know, hundreds of thousands of war crimes that have been committed by Russian Federation. I mean, of course, we will never be able to just forget about them because, you know, these war crimes are heinous, they happen regularly, and sooner or later Russia will have to be brought to account for everything they have done.
Okay, so you're making it sound like Ukraine's original red lines are still the same red lines as they always have been. Have they shifted at all?
Well, they have, of course, because if you, for example, look back 2 years from now, you know, we were saying that for us, the minimum requirement was the retaking of all of our territories. But look, we are realistic. We understand that, you know, the balance of powers is such at the moment along the front lines that neither party is capable of moving the front line considerably. And understanding this realistic situation on the ground means that our position has shifted. We agree now that, okay, ceasefire needs to happen along the existing front line. This does not mean that we will ever recognize the legality of Russian title to those illegally annexed territories, but at the same time, we understand that we are not in a position to require all of Ukrainian territory to be returned to us at this stage. So our position has shifted. We have shown that we are flexible. We have shown that we are realistic. And we will now have to see that Russians are capable as well of this.
Right, and we might see more because the US presidential advisor, Steve Witkoff, is due to visit Moscow, we think, next week. He's going to have talks with President Putin, accompanied by President Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. What does that tell us about how close we are to reaching some sort of a conclusion here?
I would like to be, as millions of Ukrainians, to be optimistic and hope that this war can be ended within the next, hopefully, couple of months. But at the same time, you know, looking at what Russia continues to do and looking at even the official statements by the Russians, and just today we have heard the press secretary of the Kremlin, Peskov, say that don't hold your breath and don't be overly optimistic about the quick ending of this war. So we have to work very hard on this peace agreement, and at the same time we have to continue to make Russia pay for the crime of aggression by destroying their oil industry so that they cannot fund their war machinery. We will continue to speak to our partners so they impose more sanctions. And at the end of the day, Russia needs to be in a position where they have no other choice but to sit down at the negotiating table and in good faith agree to the terms that will be offered to them.
Okay, one thing we've heard from some European leaders is a notion that it's very well to end the war, but the important thing is not to sow the seeds for any future conflicts. And do you think there is a risk here that a hurried end to this war, a hurried deal, could undermine this notion of bringing about a lasting peace? Is that a real risk?
That risk is very, very real, and this is why we insist, the Ukrainian government insists, that before anything is signed, it has to be very well thought through, and security guarantees must be part of that arrangement, must be part of that peace agreement, because we will never, ever trust Russia, who has invaded us on so many occasions. And we understand very well that Russia's ultimate goal is not Donbass. Their ultimate goal is not control a few more Ukrainian territories. Their ultimate goal is wiping out Ukraine from the world map, destroying and annihilating our statehood. So this means that we will, going forward, even after the peace agreement is signed, we will continue to develop our defense industry. We will continue to partner with other European and world countries to produce efficient modern weapon systems. And of course, there are other types of security guarantees that have to be envisaged if we want to ensure a lasting peace, a peace that will not be fragile and it will not fall apart, a few months down the line.
One of the interesting comments that I saw, just staying on a similar theme, the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, said, Ukraine's security is Europe's security. Ukraine remains a first step in a much bigger game. What do you think she meant by that?
Well, she meant by that, of course, Russia, if it is allowed to have its way in Ukraine, it will not probably stop in Ukraine, because the Kremlin doesn't abandon its neo-imperial ambitions, and the Kremlin wants to spread its sphere of influence, which is the same as their sphere of fear, further into the Western countries. And, we have already seen Russian drones entering European airspace. We know that Russia has plans for the Baltic states. So European Union and European continent is strong for only as long as Ukraine is strong. This is why we have so much support from the European countries in these difficult times.
Last week, I had a memorable interview with one of President Putin's former spokespeople, a man by the name of Sergei Markov. And he told me that everyone in Ukraine wants to be Russian. How would you respond to such a comment?
I have had, unfortunately, a number of times an opportunity to debate certain contentious issues with Mr. Markov on different platforms. And I would just not even grace his comments with my answer, because everything that comes out of his mouth is propaganda based on falsities.
Okay. I want to ask you about another issue. It appears, and this is according to a leak from Bloomberg, and I'm sure you're aware, that President Putin's former policy advisor, a man by the name of Yuriy Sak, has been given coaching on how to sell the peace plan to President Trump. And that coaching came from none other than Steve Witkoff. I wonder what the reaction to that news has been in Ukraine. Has it undermined trust with Washington?
Of course, this came as a shock. This appeared in our news last night. And on the one hand, we don't want to interfere with the negotiating tactics of our strategic partner, United States of America. And of course, we understand that, and your viewers understand that, what we see finally on the television screens is only a tip of the iceberg. There's a lot of work put in behind the scenes, which makes these diplomatic efforts move forward. So there is one way to look at those phone calls between Mr. Witkoff and Ushakov, that it's part of the diplomatic track. It's what happens, Mr. Witkoff probably was given a task by Donald Trump to make this peace agreement happen, and he's trying, to the best of his abilities to ensure that he achieves success. But one thing we are worried about, that we don't want this to be to put Ukraine at a disadvantage.
Okay, just to wrap up our conversation, Mr. Sak, after 3 years and 9 months of efforts, of peace plans, of summits, and so on, President Trump sounding optimistic about this plan. Does it feel to you like this is the closest we've ever got to some sort of a conclusion to the war?
One thing we know is that Donald Trump does have cards. He sometimes is known to have said that we don't have the cards, But we know that he does have the cards. And we hope that when he says that he's very optimistic about a very quick ending to this war, and we hope that he is almost ready to use his cards, which is in line with his formula, peace through strength. So let's wait and see. But I will repeat that as far as the Russian position is concerned, we are very skeptical. And unfortunately, there is always a risk that Russian maximalistic demands can derail the peace process, regardless of the intentions of the White House.
Okay, well, we appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Thank you very much indeed. Yuriy Sak, former advisor to the Ukrainian Defence Ministry. Thank you for your time, sir.
Thank you.
Well, let's get some more analysis. We can speak now to Volker, who's former US Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations and former US Ambassador to NATO. He joins us from Virginia in the United States. Thank you very much indeed for joining us once again, Ambassador. Let's start by talking about that 28-point plan that surfaced last week. Some Europeans and some US officials called it a list of Russian positions and not a serious proposal. What went through your mind when you first saw that 28-point plan last week?
Yes, exactly. My first reaction was, here we go again. We have adopting Russian proposals, putting some pressure on Ukraine. This is clearly not going to go anywhere. The Ukrainians can't accept it. The Europeans can't accept it. And we'll end up with amending this. We'll fix this somehow. And then Russia will refuse to accept it. And then we're right back at trying to figure out how to pressure Putin to have a ceasefire. So, one more round, just like we had at the Alaska summit, all over again.
Right. So you think, in fact, Ukraine has played its cards quite skillfully by not showing any resistance to this plan, perhaps in the knowledge, as you say, that the plan was never going to see the light of day. Is that roughly what you think the calculation might have been in Kyiv?
Well, I think they know that rather than confronting Trump and arguing with the United States, it's better to say, we're always willing to talk, we're always willing to negotiate, we're ready to meet anytime, anywhere. Let's get to work on this. And that's exactly what they did. And Rubio was dispatched to go do that. And Rubio could see this plan for what it was and knew that it had to be adjusted. So I think this was all very well played to take something that was unacceptable and turn it into something acceptable that puts the onus back on the Russians to agree to a ceasefire or not.
Right, so now that it's acceptable to Ukraine, and as President Trump said yesterday, it's been, quote, fine-tuned, what you're saying now is it's now become unacceptable to the Russians, and therefore they're going to reject it outright, do you think?
Yes, I do. I think from what we heard from Foreign Minister Lavrov this morning, I don't expect them to actually engage on any negotiations. I think they're going to say, no, we were prepared to work off of the original plan, but we're not prepared to work off of this one. Just no negotiating. That's what I expect from them.
So Steve Witkoff, who's going to Russia next week, we're told, will be at the Kremlin holding talks with Jared Kushner, according to reports. Are they going to be wasting their time?
Well, look, I suppose it's always good to go and talk, and hopefully they begin to learn. The fact that Witkoff had these conversations with Russian officials as if Russia's a partner and Ukraine is an object that we just have to, divide up ourselves, that is clearly not the right way to be understanding what's going on in the world. And hopefully with a plan that President Trump, President Zelenskyy, European leaders are all comfortable with, to then get a dose of this is all unacceptable from Russia, maybe that will be a little bit of a wake-up call.
Right, you're alluding to this leaked report by Bloomberg, which says that Putin's foreign policy advisor was given some coaching and some prepping by Steve Witkoff on how to sell this plan to President Trump. I assume that's what you're alluding to. And
Yes.
And one Republican, in fact, by the name of Don Bacon, who's a Nebraska Republican, said that that leak proves that Witkoff favors the Russians. And that's coming from a Republican. I mean, what's been the reaction there amongst your colleagues and former colleagues to this news that Steve Witkoff has been helping the Russians to pitch their plan back to America? I mean, it's very unusual, isn't it?
It certainly is, and I don't know. I haven't spoken to anyone this morning yet about their views on this, but my guess is that no one is surprised that Witkoff has adopted a Russian view of this from the beginning. And so it's no surprise that he's talking with them about what the plan should be and how to pitch it. What is really striking to me is that, as I said, Russia is the aggressor here. Russia is killing civilians. They're seizing territory from another country. They're abducting children. They're erasing Ukrainian language and culture wherever they can. And this proposal acts as though, well, Russia is the partner of the United States, or the U.S. is Russia's partner, and Ukraine is the problem to be limited and to be carved up and to be put in its place. That is just a fundamentally wrong way of understanding what's going on here and a wrong way of understanding American interests. Now, what's interesting is I don't think President Trump was ever bought into this plan. I think he just wants peace, and he wants there to be a process for how to get there, and he doesn't really care about the details. So with Witkoff and maybe also Vice President Vance saying, well, here's a plan. I think Trump's view is, yeah, give it a try. And then when it encountered so much resistance from not only the Ukrainians, but Europeans and Republicans in the Congress and in the Senate and experts, the media, everyone saw right through this. Trump said, well, it's not the final plan, but there will be adjustments. And, the deadline's not really a deadline because, if we're making progress, deadlines come and go. And so then he dispatches Rubio to go fix it. And Rubio does that in his meetings with the Ukrainians and European leaders. And now it looks as though emerging from that is a reasonable plan that people can live with. And this is where now Russia's going to say, oh, well, we can't live with that.
Okay, we mentioned quite a lot of the well-known names in this discussion. They've been names we've talked about on this channel for several months, the Steve Witkoffs, the Jared Kushners, the Marco Rubios. But there's one name you haven't mentioned so far, and I want to ask you about him. The US Secretary of the Army, Dan Driscoll. Perhaps less well-known internationally than some of those other people we've talked about. But he seems to have been playing a pretty central role in brokering this agreement. How important do you think his role has been?
Well, I think it is helpful. It's good to have someone who is expert in military affairs, which he is, who can talk to the Ukrainians. I think that he will observe that the Ukrainians have done a lot with their own technology, their own drones, their own electronic warfare, that they've been able to hold off the Russians pretty effectively. So I think he'll gain some appreciation for that from his meetings. As a former military guy, he's not going to be a political leader. He's not going to be making decisions about what the U.S. policy is. That's only Donald Trump, really. But military guys tend to be very direct and very straight about representing what the political leadership wants. And so I think he'll do that effectively. But again, I have to stress the only decision maker here is President Trump. And this is why you have a Witkoff plan that goes off the rails. Why then Trump steps in, you get Rubio, he pulls it back. Now you have more talks with Witkoff and Driscoll. But ultimately, the fundamentals have not changed. The fundamentals are that Vladimir Putin started this war and continues this war. And if you want the war to end, it's going to be Vladimir Putin who has to decide to have a ceasefire, because nobody else wants the war. The Ukrainians are ready for a ceasefire, Europe, United States. It's only Putin, and Putin has to be the one to call for a ceasefire or to accept a ceasefire. And he'll only do that if he feels that he is facing very difficult financial and military choices. Right now, he doesn't feel that.
And Ambassador, when we talk about all these different names and these different approaches to this same issue, are you getting the sense that there are some divisions and some, perhaps, for lack of a better word, some tensions in the ranks of the Trump administration on, how to solve this problem and who is ultimately going to get the ball across the line?
Yeah, I think so. And it boils down to a couple of issues. One of them is Marco Rubio is confirmed by the Senate and nominated by President Trump as the Secretary of State. He is actually responsible for U.S. foreign affairs by statute, even though, the reality can always vary person to person. But here you have Steve Witkoff, who has no confirmed role, but is a friend of President Trump, who steps in and tries to do things with the Russians. And Witkoff has no idea about the culture, the history, the language, the diplomacy. He's never been to Ukraine. And so the plan that he comes up with is drafted by the Russians and has gross mistakes, errors, naivetes. It's fully one-sided. It says things such as, in one place, there'll be a recognition that parts of Ukraine are de facto controlled by Russia. Well, that's a non sequitur. If they're de facto controlled, it means you don't recognize it in diplomatic terms. If you recognize it, you are legitimizing it as being Russian, which we should never do. So even that was just a fundamental flaw in the plan, and there are many others. So I think this causes tension between some of the actors in the Trump administration, whether there's expertise or non-expertise, whether there is official responsibility or informal activity. And we saw this also, I would just mention that the Special Envoy for Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, announced at the same time that this plan came out that he is not planning to stay on in his role after January. So I think that is also a reflection of the fact that the guy who's supposed to be responsible for this is not actually given the responsibility.
Right, and actually, interestingly enough, last week we spoke to a former US ambassador to Ukraine on the day that the 28-point plan came to light. And his initial reaction to it was that this was fake news and that this was could not possibly be an official government position from the United States. I mean, is that roughly what you thought?
No, I believed it. I fully believed that this is what Witkoff and others are capable of, but it wouldn't remain the U.S. position, that this was something that was cooked up with Dmitriev, Putin's envoy, but it was going to fizzle out because it's not something that anyone could reasonably support. So it'll get changed and we'll be back where we were again. And that is, in fact, exactly how it's playing out.
Does it feel like now is the right time to be making a deal, or do you think perhaps there's an argument for leaving this for a while and perhaps giving Ukraine a slightly stronger position to negotiate from, as opposed to the week when President Zelenskyy is embroiled in a corruption scandal in the ranks of his own cabinet, and perhaps approach it at a slightly different point in time? What do you think about that?
Well, I think what you're getting at is that the conditions have to be right for the Russians to want to end the war. Ukraine already wants to end the war. They never wanted the war to begin with. They were attacked. But to get the Russians to stop, you got to get the conditions for them to want that. And we haven't ever done that. We need to ramp up the pressure on their finances, their economy, deliver the longer range weapons that Ukraine can use to go after military sites deep inside Russia. Those are things that we have still not done. But if we do those things, if we increase the pressure on Putin, it is the time to press him and say, look, this is bad already for you, and it's going to keep getting worse unless you do a deal or unless you have a ceasefire. So do this now. I also think that we will end up with a ceasefire but no agreement. Putin will never back off of his maximalist demands to eliminate Ukraine as an independent state. But he could possibly agree to a ceasefire where we're not pursuing this by military means anymore. And that's what I think we should be aiming at. Change the conditions, make it harder for Putin, starve the finances, and then also call for an immediate ceasefire.
So just to wrap up this conversation, I mean, President Trump sounds very optimistic about this plan, and he thinks that, perhaps we're the closest we've ever been to ending this war. I mean, it really doesn't sound like you share that optimism in the slightest.
I don't. No, I don't. I think it's good for Rubio to be talking this up as progress. You don't want Trump to conclude that the Ukrainians are obstructing progress. So you want to think there's progress. And for President Trump to be talking it up, hopefully that raises the stakes on Putin in terms of his just rejecting it outright. Maybe he won't just reject it outright. But that being said, I don't buy it. I think that this is not real progress, and Putin, because real progress would depend on Putin being willing to end the war, and we simply don't see that.
Okay, we can leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Really appreciate it. Kurt Volker, former US Special Representative for Ukraine and negotiations, and former US Ambassador to NATO. Thank you for your time, sir.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Well, let's get more analysis now. We can speak to Michael Carpenter, who's a former US ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe under President Biden, and now a senior fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. He joins us from Washington. Ambassador Carpenter, thank you very much indeed for talking to us. I'd like to start by asking you about what's changed since we first heard about that 28-point plan. Reports of it surfaced sometime last week. What went through your mind when you first heard about it, and how do you think it has changed since it first entered the public domain?
Well, the original 28-point plan was quite extraordinary in the sense that it was a document that was completely lopsided in support of Putin's maximalist demands. It read like a Russian document. There were obviously a few points in there that did not seem like they were entirely pro-Russian, but on the whole, the document was heavily skewed in favor of Russia's position. And as such, it was obvious would be completely unacceptable, not just to the Ukrainians, but to all European countries, with the possible exception of Viktor Orban's Hungary, which did in fact support that original proposal. Since then, of course, it's gone through a number of changes, and now we have a document that has been modified with the support of Britain, the Germans, and the French, which is more, I would say, balanced, although probably at the end of the day unacceptable to Putin.
Right, I was going to say, if it's been redacted to that extent, I mean, what are the Russians going to say about this? Will they accept such a heavily revised version? Or is this document simply going to go back and forth for quite some time to come?
Well, I think eventually this document is going to be buried, and I don't think it's going to serve as the basis for a peace deal. And I've been saying this for a long time because I just don't think that the fundamentals align here. I don't think there's a proposal that will simultaneously meet with Russia's demands and with Ukraine's demands. I just don't think that's possible, for the very simple reason that I think Putin wants to be able to preserve the option of reattacking Ukraine at some point in the future. Because for Putin, if there's peace, and if Ukraine or rump Ukraine is able to integrate with the European Union and has some modicum of peace and stability and democracy, that is a strategic defeat for Vladimir Putin. And by the same token, I think Volodymyr Zelenskyy is unable to agree to anything that does not provide those security guarantees, rock solid security guarantees, which are not envisaged in any of these plans, that would allow Ukraine to integrate with the European Union and have peace. So between those two camps, I just don't see how there's a middle ground. Okay.
I mean, do you think the Trump administration and everyone in Washington is on the same page here? Because, sitting from where I am on the other side of the world, it looks like there are some differences of opinion on the best way forward. Even at the very highest level, people did seem to be quite taken by surprise by the 28-point plan we were just talking about. Do you think everyone is singing from the same song sheet here?
Well, no, clearly they're not. And clearly there are differences, in fact, stark differences that have emerged from rival camps inside the Trump administration. I think the most important point, however, is that President Trump himself endorsed the original 28-point plan that was worked out by his Special Envoy Steve Witkoff together with Russian envoy Kirill Dmitriev. So the fact that Trump himself endorsed it, I think is very telling. But if we're to believe what's being written in the press, then it appears that Witkoff is not just a surrogate for Trump, but has been working very closely with Jared Kushner and with the vice president's office, or potentially even with Vice President Vance himself, suggesting that the weight of the Trump administration supported this very pro-Russian proposal. The outliers, if you will, in Washington are Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. Those two have been much more skeptical of Putin and wanting to impose costs to leverage a negotiation that is more even-handed. But they appear to be outliers. And as I said, Trump himself endorsed the original 28-point plan. And I think that is the most important data point to take away from this discussion.
Ambassador, I want to ask you about a leak that Bloomberg has published. They say that President Putin's former foreign policy advisor, Yuriy Sak, was briefed and coached in a way by Steve Witkoff on how to win over President Trump's support for this peace plan. The White House was asked about this, and they said this is standard negotiating procedure. In your experience of these matters, is that standard negotiating procedure?
No, not at all. I mean, it's unusual for an American to be coaching a foreign interlocutor, in this case, an adversary, one of America's primary adversaries, in fact, on how to approach the president. Now, that said, there are times where we have discussed with foreign interlocutors, and I've done this myself on numerous occasions, the framing for a future conversation, either a phone call or a meeting in the White House. That is normal. But putting words into a foreign head of state's mouth on how to approach one's own boss, one's own principal, is a little bit unusual. And of course, the fact of this leak is also very unusual because it must be coming, I would suspect, either from the United States or from Russia.
Right, and if it comes from Russia, I mean, what's their objective here? Because, I mean, reading between the lines, I mean, there are some trust issues already between the United States and their European allies. And such a conversation and such a set of circumstances is only likely to broaden the gulf in trust between the two sides, isn't it?
I think that's right. I frankly, I don't see much of a Russian motive unless it was some sort of a personal vendetta against either Yuriy Sak or against most likely Kirill Dmitriev. But I think that's unlikely. I think more likely is that this came from the American side. And then you have to ask the same question, you know, why? Probably from someone inside the administration who was appalled by the substance of the 28-point plan. But that's just guesswork. At this point, we don't know.
I mean, European leaders are clearly very uneasy about all of this. We've heard European leaders saying that this plan rewards Russian aggression, or words to that effect. Are they right?
No, absolutely, they're right. The original 28-point plan would have given Russia not just territory that it has conquered by force, violating all norms and international law in order to do so, but it would have also given Russia territory that Ukraine currently controls. And it would have neutered Ukraine's military, making it impossible for Ukraine to defend itself against future Russian attacks. I mean, this was a capitulation plan, and those who say that are not being hyperbolic. That this is truly a plan that would have sold out Ukraine to the Russians. It had all the elements that they wanted. Yes, there was some language there about security guarantees. It was very superficial, very flimsy, unlikely ever to be treated seriously by the Ukrainians. And so, yeah, it's kind of shocking that this is a plan that was endorsed by the President and Vice President of the United States of America.
And why do you think, I mean, there is this perception, and you can correct me if you disagree, I mean, there is a perception that this is all being done in a rather hurried manner, and that in fact, the timing right now, when you look at it from Ukraine's perspective, really isn't ideal. President Zelenskyy has been dealing with a corruption scandal in his cabinet on the front line. You know, things aren't looking too good for Ukraine at this particular moment. Wouldn't it be more prudent, given that the conflict will freeze during the winter months anyway, to use the time available, i.e. the time when the conflict will be frozen, to perhaps thrash out a rather better deal? What do you think of that?
Well, I'm not sure that the conflict will entirely freeze during the winter months. Yes, the battlefield becomes more transparent when there's snow on the ground and there's no foliage. But I think the incremental gains that Russia has eked out over the course of the last few months could continue. Ukraine could also try to launch some sort of a localized counteroffensive somewhere. I think it's unlikely. I think you're generally right that it will be more or less static. But I think whoever, wanted to push this plan right now probably was taking advantage of the fact that Zelenskyy is weakened by the corruption scandal, which touched on individuals very close to him personally. And so that was probably deliberate in my view. I don't know because Steve Witkoff was doing the negotiating with the Russian side. Was Witkoff, was this part of the plan or was it just coincidence? I can't say for sure, but certainly Zelenskyy does seem a little bit more embattled right now. But look, at the end of the day, he's not going to agree to something that sells out Ukrainian sovereignty, because he'll have a mutiny on his hands back home if he does. And he knows that very well. So not that he would do it anyway, but he's not going to sell out his country's sovereignty just because this is an opportune moment for the other side.
Do you think he'll still be the president of Ukraine after the war has finished?
Well, that's a question that's very difficult for me to answer. There's the Churchill example of wartime leaders who have been widely admired and who have successfully prosecuted a very difficult situation during a time of war, who then, when peace comes around, are discarded in favor of new leaders. Zelenskyy does now have some baggage in terms of this corruption scandal, in terms of some of his previous dealings with the anti-corruption agencies in Ukraine. But whether he is reelected to a second term or whether another candidate is successful, it's very hard to predict, because that's a long ways off. And there's so many variables that come into play between now and then.
Let's talk about pressure on the Russian side. Clearly they're making small incremental gains, but at an enormous human cost. And then when you look at the economy, there are a couple of indicators that would suggest they are feeling some pain from this war and the sanctions that have been imposed on them. On that front, has anything been painful enough to perhaps force the Russian hand?
No, not at this point in time. Unfortunately, Western sanctions have a long history of being performative and of truly being decisive. And a lot of analysts and a lot of just lay observers of the situation conclude that sanctions are ineffective as policy tools. And as currently employed, that may be correct, but not in a general sense, because there certainly are steps the United States could take, particularly with regards to secondary sanctions on China, which is a major consumer of Russian oil, that would cause lots of pain in the Russian economy. Similarly, in the early stages of the war, we could have taken much more drastic measures, both on Russia's financial sector and its energy sector, but chose not to for various reasons. And so there is still plenty of headroom to apply more sanctions on Russia and to really cripple the Russian economy. I think Scott Bessent, actually, the Treasury Secretary, made a comment a few months ago where he said the United States could cripple the Russian economy if it wanted to. And he's absolutely right.
Okay, so just to wrap up this conversation, how would you characterize the current peace effort, assuming it is signed by both sides? Is it, in a way, handing the Russians a victory?
It's a little bit of a PR victory for the Russians, because it shows just how close the White House is to their position on how this war ought to end. And so, yes, I think in the information space, Russia comes away with, a notch in their column. However, I do think that this proposal ping-pongs back and forth, and ultimately it's going to be up to the Europeans if they want to take the initiative away from the United States and actually provide Ukraine with a reparations loan and the resources to be able to defend Ukrainian territory for the years to come, or whether they sit on the sidelines, as they have been for the last 10 plus months of the Trump administration. So the ball is really in the Europeans' court right now. I don't think this proposal as currently drafted or as amended is going to go anywhere.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for your time. Michael Carpenter, former US ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation under President Biden. Thank you very much indeed for your time, sir.
My pleasure.
Now, the United States says it will designate certain branches of the Muslim Brotherhood as foreign terrorist organizations. Well, President Trump has signed an executive order imposing broad travel and economic restrictions, reviving efforts he pursued during his first term. All the measures will target branches of the movement in Egypt, Lebanon and Jordan, with President Trump claiming that the Jordanian branch has long supported Hamas. Well, this makes the United States the latest in a long list of countries, amongst them Egypt, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, to outlaw the movement, which was founded during the 1920s. Well, let's get more now from Mick Mulroy, who is a former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East. He joins us from Montana in the United States. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. First of all, designating certain chapters or branches of the Muslim Brotherhood as foreign terrorist organizations, how significant is this step?
So, Tom, it is a significant step. Inside the State Department, there is a ability to be designated a foreign terrorist organization, and it has three basic criteria. The first is that it's an organization, right? So you have to be able to identify it and essentially nail it down. It does have to be conducting terrorist attacks. And in the U.S., it has to be either geared toward American citizens or U.S. interests. Of course, the last category can be broadly interpreted. And that, as you mentioned correctly, gives the U.S. the ability to do things like travel restrictions and sanctions. It doesn't necessarily mean military action, which has been something that's been conflated and talked about during the issues with Venezuela right now.
Okay, for people who don't know, the Muslim Brotherhood was founded about 100 years ago in the 1920s in Egypt. And that raises the question, why 100 years after this organization was founded, has the Trump administration decided now is the time to crack down? Has there been an event or a particular issue that's prompted this, do you think?
Well, of course, we did see Saudi Arabia, the Crown Prince, come to the United States recently. It might have been something that they were pushing for the United States to do. If the United States does this, it obviously will have a significant impact on these chapters. This is kind of a broad organization with different chapters. It's not necessarily all unified, but for certain chapters that are designated, this will make it very difficult for them to raise money, right? So any organization, including a terrorist organization, if that's how the U.S. and that is how the U.S. is going to view these certain chapters, raise money. That's how they survive. So this does give them the ability. It might be diplomatic pressure from Saudi Arabia, potentially from the UAE. That's speculation on my part. The other potential is that the intelligence said that several chapters were conducting terrorist attacks, and that the White House and the State Department deemed them as a contrary to U.S. national interest, therefore fitting the statute requirements that we already talked about.
Okay, since you mentioned the money, how much money does the Muslim Brotherhood have, and where does it get it from?
So I don't know how much they collect, and I imagine it's done by individual chapters, but certainly in the United States, there would be a means to collect money for these chapters. If they're not designated, obviously, as a terrorist organization, then there shouldn't be any restriction. If they are, then that would be material support to a terrorist organization, which in and of itself could be considered a crime, could get severe restrictions, penalties, financial penalties, and essentially that group could be banned from using the banking system, for example, or banned from travel, and potentially have a Department of Justice investigation opened on them. So the designation, although it doesn't include the authorized use of military force from a State Department designation, it does carry a lot of consequences financially and diplomatically.
Okay, the Muslim Brotherhood has terrorist status in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and other countries. I mean, are there any countries where they are perhaps more warmly viewed or viewed in a more friendly way? Who's supporting them?
Yeah, Tom. So that's one of the issues is there are chapters in countries that we have strong diplomatic relationships with. For example, Jordan, who is a great partner of the United States. How this would change our relationship with those countries is unclear. if they have a faction of their political spectrum that is deemed a foreign terrorist organization chapter of the Muslim Brotherhood, how does the U.S. then go about carrying out normal diplomatic relationship with the government writ large? That's a question I don't know the answer to, but certainly that is something that we're going to have to grapple with here in the United States to determine how that will be done, because it's just simply not the case normally where you would have what I would say a traditional terrorist organization like Al Qaeda being a substantial part of a foreign partner's government. So that is going to have to be looked at. I don't know the specific designations of the chapters, so maybe it's not as important as I'm making it out to be. But if that is the case, it's going to have to be addressed on just how the diplomatic relationships would change.
Right. So clearly the Muslim Brotherhood is the thorn in the side of a lot of countries around the world. And we've talked about countries in the Middle East, obviously the United States with this new executive order. Earlier this year, President Macron in France ordered his government to draw up some proposals to counter the influence of the Muslim Brotherhood and the spread of its influence there. I mean, that's not quite the same as banning it or deeming it to be a foreign terrorist organization. Does that sound like France and Europe in general being perhaps a little bit too soft on this kind of organization and perhaps a little naive?
Well, it really does come down to what the intelligence says. If they are a traditional political organization that's not advocating for violence, then essentially in a free democracy, that should be taken into account. I don't know what it is that this U.S. State Department's looking at now, if it indicates that they're advocating openly for violence or they're supporting groups that do, then that would indicate the need for this foreign terrorist organization, and perhaps Europe should review the same information, which is generally shared between allies like the United States and our European countries. If that's not the case, then I guess it would be more appropriate to simply watch and observe and see if it gets to that level. And it's not just specific to the Muslim Brotherhood. That would be any organization that openly advocates for violence or political means. But I don't know what the Europeans are looking at or specifically what the U.S. is looking at. It could have came from diplomatic pressure. It could have came from intelligence information or a combination of both.
Again, how much support do we think the Muslim Brotherhood has been giving to Hamas over the years?
So that's the question that I think is most acute. I don't know. I haven't been in government to look at classified reports for many years. But I do believe that those that are might have been looking at that. If you provide material support, which obviously finances a group like Hamas, which is clearly a terrorist organization, then you are a material supporter, and that is against the law in most countries, and it would definitely earn you a spot on a foreign terrorist organization list. So I don't know if that's accurate, but if it is, it would indicate that that is the intelligence part of the calculation that went into making this designation.
Okay, and just how much influence does the Muslim Brotherhood have around the world? I mean, clearly there are places in the United States, pockets in the United States that have centers for Muslim people to attend. I mean, is there a feeling that perhaps some of those centers could be funded by or used by the Muslim Brotherhood? Do you think that's part of what President Trump is getting at here?
Well, as you mentioned, Tom, the organization is very old. It's had influence, particularly in Egypt, substantial influence. Some would say that they also advocate for the jihadist form of terrorism. To the extent that that is, perhaps it's certain chapters, perhaps it's people using the cover of Muslim Brotherhood to advocate for these groups. But clearly that has to be determined by an objective analysis of intelligence and then reviewed from the point of view of law enforcement and diplomacy. In this case, the U.S. State Department determining that they've reached this threshold, which is clearly laid out. So it's not subjective. There's an objective criteria for meeting this. If that's the case, then that's what happened here, and it's going to change the dynamics of how they can not only collect for different causes in the United States, If they're a designated terrorist organization, they essentially can't collect money in the United States because the individuals that would be contributing to a foreign terrorist organization, which in itself is a crime. So it's going to have a significant impact in the United States. And of course, the banking system around the world could be affected as well because of this designation.
Okay, I mean, people will remember the Muslim Brotherhood because in 2013, the president of Egypt was overthrown. He was Mohamed Morsi, and he was at the time the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood. How significant an event was his overthrow? And was that sort of the beginning of the end of perhaps the influence that the Muslim Brotherhood wielded in Egypt?
I think that's a good point. That could have been the pinnacle right there with their opportunity to run a country that obviously did not end well. And I think it's viewed in that manner. Whether that had anything to do now with the designation as a foreign terrorist organization, I don't know. But certainly if these groups, if these chapters are essentially not just advocating for a particular political view, but a political view that's calls for the violent overthrow of a government or an attack on individual citizens, or the direct support to groups that do those things, like Al-Qaeda, like ISIS, and others, then that's how they're going to earn this designation. And if that's the case, then they're going to be clamped down on all around the world. If the U.S. has the information, I imagine they're going to share it with our close allies and partners, which is known as the Five Eyes, of course, but also our European partners and our partners around the world, where they may have branches that could be doing something similar to what the U.S. is obviously accusing certain chapters of.
Okay, well, we appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Thank you very much indeed. Mick Mulroy, former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thanks, Tom. Good to be with you.
Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.